Venice, Italy, September 4th, 1979. By mid-morning, the Grand Canal is crowded with tourists. Delivery boats weave between gondolas. Cafés older than most nations serve espresso to travelers. At 10:45 hours, Soviet intelligence officer Major Yuri Volkov sits on the terrace of Caffè Florian. He sips his coffee and reviews papers with an Italian contact. He believes he is untouchable. No rooftops, no clear sight lines, no fixed ground to support a sniper position. But 260 meters away, a public traghetto ferry named Line 1R is mid-crossing. This humble commuter vessel is carrying something Venice has never seen before, a British sniper platform already in motion. This is Operation Black Gondola. Yuri Volkov was not a diplomat. He was not officially in Italy. Born in 1938 in Leningrad, Volkov survived the siege as a child. 900 days of starvation and shelling shaped him in ways psychology textbooks cannot fully explain. He learned discipline through deprivation. He learned emotional restraint through loss. By age 15, Volkov had already mastered what intelligence services would later call compartmentalization, the ability to separate what you know from what you feel. By the late 1970s, Volkov was a KGB illegal. He operated under deep cover across Western Europe. His defining skill was not violence, but coordination. He built networks that never touched Moscow directly. Each contact believed they were working with someone else. Each financial conduit appeared independent. Each communication channel seemed isolated. The architecture was brilliant because it was invisible. By 1979, Italy had become one of his most valuable theaters. The Italian Communist Party was the strongest in Western Europe. NATO's southern flank was porous. The Red Brigades had proven the state could be destabilized without invasion. Volkov's job was to synchronize ideological allies, financial conduits, and secure communications. He did this quietly, patiently, invisibly. Associates described him as methodical, never impulsive. He carried no weapon. He left no pattern. Intercepted surveillance from July 1979 showed Volkov discussing art restoration with a Florentine academic. The conversation contained nothing actionable, but analysts noted the precision of his Italian, the ease of his cover, the complete absence of tells that marked other illegals. To British intelligence, Volkov was not just an operator. He was a multiplier. Remove him, and entire networks would stall. Recruitment chains would fragment. Financial flows would freeze. The effect would cascade for months, possibly years. Intelligence services had tracked Volkov for 18 months. By August 1979, MI6 concluded Volkov represented what analysts called a strategic node, a single individual whose removal would damage Soviet operations more than any document theft or counterintelligence exposure. The authorization to eliminate him came in late August. The method was left to field discretion. The constraint was absolute. No attribution. MI6 called this the Phantom Protocol. The logic was straightforward. Disrupt without fingerprints. Eliminate without escalation. Direct arrests risked diplomatic retaliation. Overt assassination risked Soviet response operations. What London needed was deniability inside chaos. Venice offered both opportunity and risk. The obstacles were immediate. Surveillance was difficult in a city built on water. Sight lines were unreliable across canals and bridges. Water disrupted conventional sniper logic. Wind shear between buildings, humidity affecting ballistics, no stable firing positions. Moving platforms introduced ballistic variables that made precision nearly impossible. Escape routes were limited to boats or crowded footbridges, where a running operative would be immediately conspicuous. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity. Venice had something other cities lacked: predictable movement. The traghetto ferries ran fixed routes on fixed schedules. Crowds made anonymity effortless. Tourist density provided visual noise. And most critically, Volkov had established a pattern. A signals intelligence confirmed he returned to Caffè Florian daily between 10:30 and 1100 hours. He always chose the same terrace table. He always faced the canal. He believed the openness made him safe. No enclosed spaces, no ambush points, constant civilian presence. Within 14 days, all elements would be in position. But first, the firing platform problem needed to be resolved. During the final preparation phase, the primary shooter experienced what handlers call legend drift. His cover identity was Simon Hartwell, a British art historian researching Venetian Gothic architecture. He had been living this identity for 9 days. He sketched buildings, he photographed facades, he spoke to locals about restoration techniques. On September 2nd, 2 days before the operation, he found himself genuinely interested in a conversation about Byzantine influence on Venetian stonework. He noticed he was thinking in his cover identity's vocabulary. He caught himself planning to visit a library that Simon Hartwell would visit, not that the operative needed to visit. The blurring was subtle but dangerous. In the post-operation psychological debrief, the assessment noted, subject maintained operational focus, but displayed moderate identity confusion markers consistent with extended deep cover protocols. Recommend 14-day minimum separation before next deployment. But the mission continued. Intercepted communications from August 30 revealed Volkov discussing his daughter's upcoming university entrance examinations. He expressed concern about her mathematics preparation. He asked his wife to hire a tutor. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant. The conversation was filed and forgotten. What they recorded was a father worried about his child's future. When the bullet struck 3 days later, his daughter was preparing for exams he would never see her take. By September 3rd, the operation entered its execution phase. Weather forecasts confirmed clear conditions for September 4th. Volkov's pattern held. He arrived at Caffè Florian at 10:42 hours. The window was 6 minutes. The operation was compartmentalized under internal designation Gondola Black. 2 SAS snipers were selected from the Special Projects Team, a unit that technically did not exist in any official order of battle. Both had maritime firing experience. Neither had previously deployed in an urban assassination scenario. Their names were excluded from all documentation, where their cover identities were mundane by design. Simon Hartwell and David Preston, British art historians affiliated with the Courtauld Institute, researching Gothic architectural elements in Venetian ecclesiastical buildings. The cover was supported by genuine institutional affiliation. The Courtauld had been approached through a cutout and believed they were facilitating legitimate academic research. The weapon was custom-built by Royal Ordnance specialists at Enfield. The base platform was a heavily modified Lee Enfield L-42A1, selected for reliability in humid conditions. The barrel was shortened to 76 centimeters to fit inside leather art portfolios. The suppressor was integrated into the barrel housing rather than attached, reducing profile. The total breakdown consisted of 5 components: barrel assembly, receiver group, stock, scope, and magazine. Ammunition was purpose-loaded. Each 7.6 2x51 mm NATO round was tuned for specific environmental factors. Propellant charge was reduced by 8% to account for humidity-affected burn rates. Bullet weight was increased to 180 grains to maintain energy through cross-canal wind drift. Over-penetration control required a specialized hollow point design that would fragment on bone contact while maintaining stability through 260 meters of open air. Communication systems were minimal. No radio contact would occur during execution. The team operated on preset timing, synchronized to a baseline established during rehearsal runs. If the traghetto departed San Marco at 44 minutes past the hour, the shooting window opened at 45 minutes and 30 seconds. And this gave the ferry exactly where it needed to be for the shot geometry to align. Escape routes were layered. Primary extraction involved simply completing the ferry crossing and dispersing into the crowd at the opposite landing. Secondary extraction required a pre-positioned water taxi at the Rialto Bridge, operated by an asset who believed he was supporting art theft documentation. Tertiary extraction involved a vehicle staged outside Venice proper, accessible via the causeway. Surveillance specialists had mapped Volkov's movement pattern across 17 separate observations between August 18th and September 3rd. Pattern analysis specialists documented his arrival time variance at plus or minus 4 minutes, his seating preference at 100% consistency, and his meeting duration at an average of 47 minutes. The execution team members were compartmentalized, absolutely. The shooter knew the target's location and the firing solution. The spotter knew the timing sequence and wind calculations. Neither knew the full strategic rationale. Neither knew the target's identity beyond a physical description and designation as Subject Crimson. Each operative knew only their immediate function to prevent catastrophic compromise scenarios where a single capture could expose the entire operation chain. The planning consumed 19 days. By September 3rd, all equipment was in Venice. The team had 12 hours before the execution window opened. September 3rd, 1979. At 1800 hours, the final rehearsal occurred. The shooter and spotter boarded the Line 1R traghetto as passengers. They carried the same leather portfolios that would contain the weapon components the following day. They timed the crossing. They measured the vessel's roll pattern across the canal. They marked the exact midpoint, 14 seconds of relatively stable lateral motion between the wake turbulence from other vessels. Wind shear between buildings was measured using a handheld anemometer disguised as a light meter. The canal created a corridor effect, funneling air movement in unpredictable patterns. At mid-morning, wind velocity averaged 8 to 12 kilometers per hour from the southwest. But the buildings created eddies that could shift 2 meters left or right at the bullet's midpoint. Over the next 6 hours, they reviewed contingencies. If Volkov deviated from pattern, the operation would abort. If weather shifted, the operation would abort. If police presence increased on the canal, the operation would abort. The window was specific because the variables were barely controlled as it was. By 2300 hours, both operatives were in separate hotel rooms. Sleep protocols required 8 hours minimum before a precision shooting operation. The spotter managed 6. The shooter managed 4. September 4th, 1979. At 0630 hours, the shooter woke and immediately checked weather conditions from his window. Clear skies, light wind, humidity at 68%, within acceptable parameters. At 0700 hours, both operatives met at a cafe 300 meters from their staging point. They did not speak beyond ordering coffee. The shooter ate a light breakfast. The spotter reviewed a tourist map, marking nothing, simply maintaining cover behavior. At 0815 hours, they separated. Each walked different routes to the San Marco Vaporetto station. The shooter arrived first and purchased a single traghetto ticket. He carried one leather portfolio containing 3 weapon components. The spotter arrived 8 minutes later, carrying the second portfolio with the remaining components and ammunition. At 0900 hours, Surveillance confirmed Volkov had left his hotel. He was walking toward the Piazza San Marco. His pattern held. At 0942 hours, Volkov arrived at Caffè Florian. He ordered espresso. He chose his usual table. He faced the canal. He opened a newspaper. What Volkov didn't know was that 260 meters across the water, two men were assembling a precision rifle from components that looked like art supplies. At 10:15 hours, the team boarded the traghetto for a timing run. They completed the crossing without incident. The ferry's schedule was running on time. They disembarked, waited 6 minutes, and boarded again for the approach that would matter. At 10:38 hours, a police launch entered the canal near the Rialto Bridge. It was conducting a routine patrol. The spotter saw it first. His assessment was immediate. If the launch maintained current heading and speed, it would create wake turbulence that would disrupt the ferry's stable crossing window. The shooter made the tactical decision to abort the 10:44 crossing and wait for the next ferry at 11:14. But then the police launch turned east, away from the shooting corridor. The approach continued. At 10:42 hours, Volkov finished his first espresso and ordered a second. He was meeting someone. An Italian man in his mid-50s arrived and sat across from him. They began discussing papers spread on the table. At 10:44 hours, the Line 1R traghetto departed San Marco. There were 43 passengers aboard. Tourists, commuters, a delivery worker carrying packages. The shooter and spotter stood near the port side rail, portfolios leaning against a timber beam. The shooter opened his portfolio at a shallow angle, shielding the interior from other passengers. He removed what appeared to be a telephoto camera lens. It was the barrel assembly. The spotter removed what appeared to be a camera body. It was the receiver group. Assembly took 38 seconds, when the suppressor was already integrated. The scope was already zeroed from the previous day's final calibration. The stock was left off. The shooter would brace directly against the beam for stability. 6 hours before execution, the ferry had carried tourists and workers. Now it carried an assassination platform that existed for exactly 14 seconds. September 4th, 1979, 10:45 hours and 18 seconds. The traghetto reached the quarter crossing point. The shooter knelt behind the timber beam, using it as a brace. The rifle was below the rail line, invisible to anyone not directly beside him. Other passengers were looking at buildings, talking, checking maps. The spotter counted the roll cycle. Venetian traghetti had a characteristic rhythm: 3 seconds left, 4 seconds neutral, 3 seconds right. The shooting window existed during the 4-second neutral phase, when the vessel's lateral motion was minimal. 10:45 hours and 28 seconds. Volkov leaned forward, lifting his cup. The motion was consistent with surveillance footage from previous mornings. He always lifted with his right hand. He always paused before drinking. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds. The spotter whispered a single word: stable. The shooter exhaled halfway and held. Breathing technique required the shot to occur at the natural respiratory pause, the moment between exhale and inhale when the body is biomechanically still. Range, 260 meters. Wind, 10 kilometers per hour from southwest. Humidity, 68%. Target elevation, 1.2 meters above waterline. For firing platform elevation, 0.8 meters above waterline. The ballistic solution required aiming 40 centimeters right of target and 12 centimeters high to account for wind drift and bullet drop. The calculation had been rehearsed 17 times. 10:45 hours and 41 seconds. The trigger broke at exactly 1,800 grams of pressure. The suppressor reduced the muzzle report to approximately 118 decibels, comparable to a car door slamming. On a crowded canal in Venice, it was indistinguishable from ambient noise. The bullet crossed 260 meters of open water in 0.4 seconds. It threaded between a passing delivery boat and a stationary gondola, with less than 2 meters of clearance on either side. Impact occurred at the base of Volkov's neck, and precisely at the C3 vertebra. The hollow point round fragmented on contact with bone. Spinal cord transection was instantaneous. Neurological shutdown occurred before pain signals could reach the brain. Volkov's cup fell from his hand. He slumped forward onto the table. The Italian contact across from him initially thought he had fainted. Elapsed time from trigger press to impact, 0.4 seconds. The shooter began disassembly immediately. The barrel assembly went back into the portfolio. The receiver group followed. Total disassembly time, 22 seconds. At 10:46 hours and 8 seconds, the traghetto completed its crossing. Passengers disembarked. The shooter and spotter walked into a crowd of commuters at the opposite landing. They separated without speaking. At 10:47 hours, someone at Caffè Florian screamed. The Italian contact had realized that Volkov was not breathing. Blood was pooling on the table. At 10:48 hours, the shooter was 300 meters away, walking along a crowded street. The rifle components were distributed between two portfolios that looked exactly like the art supply cases carried by dozens of other tourists in Venice that morning. At 10:51 hours, the spotter was aboard a vaporetto heading toward the train station. He carried nothing that would connect him to the shooting. His hands were clean. His clothes showed no residue. At 1100 hours, both operatives were in separate locations, maintaining their cover identities. They would not leave Venice for another 36 hours. Immediate departure would create pattern anomalies that investigators might notice later. By 11:15 hours, Italian police had secured Caffè Florian. Volkov was pronounced dead at the scene. The bullet had fragmented completely. No exit wound existed. The entry wound was consistent with a high-velocity rifle round, but the angle suggested a shot from across the canal. Investigators looked for rooftop positions. They found none with clear sight lines. They looked for ground-level positions. They found none with the correct angle. They looked for boats that might have carried a shooter. They found 17 vessels in the area at the time, but none had slowed or stopped. The method about to be documented in after-action reports was something no intelligence service had previously attempted. A precision assassination from a moving public ferry in one of the most surveilled tourist destinations in Europe. While investigators searched for a fixed firing position, the weapon that killed Volkov was being disassembled a final time in a hotel room 400 meters away. Each component was cleaned with solvent that left no residue. The barrel was wiped with a cloth that would be burned. The scope was cleaned and separated from its mounting bracket. By 1800 hours, September 4th, the barrel assembly had been dropped into the Venice lagoon from a water taxi, weighted with marine epoxy to prevent floating. The receiver group would be dropped from the Causeway Bridge the following morning during the operative's departure. The scope would be destroyed in London. September 5th, 1979. At 0900 hours, both operatives departed Venice by train. They traveled separately to Munich. From Munich, they flew separately to London. They would not meet again for 6 weeks. By September 6th, Italian investigators had interviewed 43 witnesses. None reported seeing a weapon. None reported hearing a gunshot. The trajectory analysis suggested a firing position that investigators concluded was impossible: a moving platform on the canal itself. The case was transferred to counterintelligence specialists who understood what conventional investigators could not. Some operations were designed to be inexplicable. By 24 hours after the shooting, Italian intelligence services understood that Yuri Volkov had not simply died. He had been executed with precision that exceeded domestic capabilities. The entry wound angle, the absence of exit trauma, the complete lack of witnesses, all suggested foreign involvement. The Soviets issued no official statement. Volkov had no official status in Italy. Acknowledging his death would require acknowledging his presence. His body was quietly repatriated through diplomatic channels that formally did not exist. British intelligence maintained absolute silence. When Italian counterintelligence made discreet inquiries through NATO liaison channels, the response was polite confusion. No British operations were active in Venice. No British personnel had been deployed to Italy that month, and the denials were transparent to those in the intelligence community. But transparency wasn't the point. What mattered was that no evidence existed to contradict the denials. Every investigative lead ended in dead ends. The hotel registrations were legitimate, but the guests had departed. The ferry passengers included no one suspicious. The weapon components had vanished. This suggested operational sophistication far beyond criminal capacity. The tactical objective was achieved. Volkov was eliminated without attribution. Soviet coordination networks in northern Italy stalled for 14 months. Recruitment chains fragmented. Financial conduits froze. The effect cascaded exactly as London had predicted. Intelligence gained through the operation's aftermath included confirmation of Soviet communication protocols, identification of 3 previously unknown support assets who exposed themselves trying to understand what happened, and documentation of Soviet damage control procedures. The strategic benefit extended beyond Italy. The operation demonstrated that MI6 could execute precision eliminations in high-visibility environments without compromise. This recalibrated Soviet risk assessments across Western Europe. The costs were calculable. Relations with Italian intelligence suffered temporary strain over perceived unilateral action. The operation revealed British maritime firing capabilities, forcing adaptation of sniper training protocols to prevent technique signature recognition. For Volkov's daughter, the consequences were permanent. She never learned what her father actually did. She was told he died of a heart attack while traveling. She became a mathematics teacher, the profession her father had worried she might not achieve. MI6's assessment was that strategic gains outweighed operational costs. Whether this proved correct became clearer over the following 18 months as Soviet operations in Italy never recovered their previous coordination levels. Was Yuri Volkov a threat to be neutralized, or a father murdered in front of tourists who never consented to be on a battlefield? One perspective argues he was a strategic node whose networks threatened NATO's southern stability during a period when the Italian state was already fragile. His elimination prevented coordination that might have supported violent destabilization. One man's death prevented broader chaos. When the alternative perspective argues he was executed among civilians who became unknowing accessories to state-sponsored killing. The cafés of Venice became a war zone without declaration. Public space was weaponized. The precedent was dangerous. If intelligence services can turn daily life into an operational theater, no space remains neutral. The answer reveals more about your worldview than about Volkov. If you believe intelligence work requires impossible choices in impossible circumstances, the operation was justified. If you believe some methods corrupt the values they claim to defend, the operation crossed a line that should never have been approached. What's your take? Was this surgical necessity or public execution? Does deniability justify invisibility? Nigo, can any operation be truly victimless when it occurs among people who never chose to be there? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you question where intelligence work ends and murder begins, hit that like button and share this with someone who thinks they know where that line is. Because in Venice, on September 4th, 1979, that line existed somewhere between a coffee cup and a moving ferry. And 20 years later, intelligence agencies worldwide had updated one fundamental assumption: movement does not mean safety. Crowds do not mean protection. And the most ordinary platforms can become the most effective weapons. The operation lasted less than 1 minute. The consequences lasted decades. And somewhere in Moscow, analysts are still trying to understand exactly how MI6 turned a public ferry into a precision execution platform that left no evidence, no witnesses, and no answers. Only one certainty remained. Venice had learned that even beauty could be weaponized, and the tourists who crossed the Grand Canal that morning never knew they had shared their commute with history's most audacious assassination platform.